Enough! That book has no power here!
Your Honor, it has the only power that matters.
Nobody stood up to the arrogant judge until the maid's daughter faced him as a genius attorney. The court recognizes the court. Judge Wallace's lips curled as laughter rippled through the gallery. His friends, his donors, his dinner guests in tailored suits. On the defense table, Eleanor Vance, housekeeper to the Wallace family for 20 years, clutched a crumpled tissue with work-worn hands. The charge, theft of the priceless diamond necklace known as Southern Star. The accuser and presiding judge were conveniently the same powerful household. "Look at me when I speak to you," Wallace drawled, drumming his gavel for effect. Confession would save the taxpayers time. Eleanor's public defender shifted, defeated before he began. "Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence." "Innocence?" Wallace's chuckle rang like glass breaking. "The jewel was found beneath her bed. Spare us the theater." He turned to the crowd, inviting their amusement. They obliged. The sound swallowed Eleanor whole. She stared at the table, at the dull shine of a broken clasp the police had found, at the life she could feel slipping through her fingers. No one would challenge him. No one ever did. Until a clear voice cut the room in half. "Actually, Your Honor, that's not far from the truth." Heads snapped toward the aisle. A girl in a worn navy coat stepped forward, chin up, eyes steady. 17-year-old Abigail Vance, Eleanor's daughter, looked more like a scholarship student on her lunch break than a legal savior. She held a thin folder to her chest the way a knight might carry a shield. Judge Wallace smiled without warmth. "And you are?" "Abigail Vance," she said, moving to the rail. "I'm representing my mother." The gallery hissed in delight. "She's not a lawyer," someone snickered. Abigail didn't blink. "No, Your Honor, but I know the law, and I know the Southern Star is famous for a feather-shaped inclusion near the clasp documented in every appraisal. The necklace found in our apartment doesn't have it. The exhibit in evidence is a fake." Silence detonated. Wallace's smirk trembled. Abigail lifted the folder. "If the court will permit, I can prove the switch and who had the keys to make it." A hush shivered across the room, the kind that arrives when power senses it's just been touched. Judge Wallace's gavel hovered in midair, caught between arrogance and fear. Would the empire of a corrupt judge collapse under the quiet precision of a maid's daughter, or would he destroy her before the truth reached daylight? The courthouse was a palace of marble and mirrors. On the third floor, courtroom 6 gleamed with oak benches polished so smooth they reflected the chandeliers above. To outsiders, it looked like a temple to justice. To locals, it was Wallace's theater. Judge Henry Wallace had ruled this chamber for 2 decades. Broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed in robes tailored to flatter his frame, he embodied authority, but not fairness. Wallace was born into privilege, inheriting both fortune and connections. He rose through political favors, not merit, and his gavel struck hardest on the poor, the voiceless, and the ones too weary to fight back. It was an open secret that Wallace used his courtroom to settle personal grudges. He extended mercy to allies and donors, but to servants, immigrants, or those who couldn't afford real counsel, he was merciless. He thrived on public humiliation, crafting speeches that played more like monologues. His friends often gathered in the gallery, sipping coffee during recesses, treating the lives of the accused as entertainment. And so, Eleanor Vance's trial had been stacked from the beginning. Eleanor was not a glamorous figure. Her uniform was simple, her hair pinned in a modest bun, her shoes scuffed from years of scrubbing floors. She had worked for the Wallace family since she was 19, a fixture in their mansion. She had ironed Judge Wallace's shirts, polished Mrs. Wallace's diamonds, carried tea trays into the drawing room when visiting dignitaries filled the house. But to the court, none of that mattered. She was a servant accused of daring to touch what wasn't hers. The necklace discovered in her rented apartment seemed damning, and the public defender assigned to her was overworked, underpaid, and already anticipating a guilty verdict. Eleanor had tried to speak for herself, but her voice shook too badly. The gavel always cut her off. Yet Abigail, her daughter, had been listening for years. At 17, Abigail was unassuming, wavy chestnut hair tied back, posture straight but modest, her dress carefully pressed, though obviously second-hand. She was the kind of student who sat at the back of the classroom, scribbling notes while others laughed at lunch. Teachers praised her essays but rarely remembered her face. What no one realized was that Abigail carried a legacy. Her great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael O'Connell, had been both a decorated war hero and a master jeweler after his service. To him, stones weren't just gems. They were stories carved into crystal, imperfections that proved authenticity. He had taught Eleanor before his death, and Eleanor had passed those lessons on to Abigail. Quiet evenings, hunched over a jeweler's loupe, learning the difference between a flawless imitation and a flawed masterpiece. Abigail grew up in silence, absorbing knowledge that others overlooked. When her mother was accused, she didn't crumble. She studied. She read legal handbooks in the library, memorized courtroom procedures, and traced the trail of arrogance in Judge Wallace's every ruling. She understood that the necklace wasn't just evidence, it was a stage prop, and she was ready to expose the script. On the prosecution side stood Henderson, the district attorney. Smooth-talking, neatly combed, he was less a lawyer than Wallace's shadow. Henderson owed his career to the judge and knew his role: validate the accusation, keep the jury entertained, and secure a conviction. On Eleanor's side, Peterson, the weary public defender, his tie was crooked, his briefcase older than Abigail herself. He had no energy left for fire, only quiet resignation. He whispered to Eleanor that the best she could hope for was a reduced sentence. The jury looked on uneasily. 12 ordinary citizens plucked from ordinary jobs, suddenly trapped in Wallace's stage play. They could see the imbalance, but who among them dared oppose the man who owned half the city's legal system? The gallery was filled with Wallace's allies, wealthy businessmen, country club members, Mrs. Wallace herself in a pearl-trimmed hat. They leaned together in whispers, waiting to see Eleanor crushed. And then Abigail stepped forward. As Abigail's voice echoed, the courtroom's rhythm cracked. The usual script judge mocks, prosecutor postures, defender mumbles was broken. For the first time in years, someone spoke without Wallace's permission, and worse, with confidence. The detail she cited, the feather-shaped flaw in the Southern Star, was not common knowledge. Even Henderson's eyes flicked in surprise. How did a teenager know the technical appraisals of one of the world's most famous diamonds? Abigail held her ground, steady but respectful. She was not reckless. She spoke with measured calm, her words chosen with surgical precision. It wasn't bravado, it was knowledge, and knowledge was dangerous in a room built on arrogance. Wallace's jaw clenched. His world was order and dominance, but this girl, this servant's daughter, had introduced something alien. Truth, undeniable and sharp. The courtroom had become a chessboard, and Wallace realized too late that someone had placed a new queen on the board. For the first time in his reign, he wasn't sure he could win. The silence that followed Abigail's declaration stretched, heavy and unbroken, until Judge Wallace's gavel slammed like a thunderclap. "Order!" he barked, though his own composure was fraying. His gaze locked on Abigail with a mix of disdain and simmering fury. "This is a courtroom, not a classroom for precocious schoolgirls. Sit down before I hold you in contempt." But Abigail didn't move. Her eyes, steady, unblinking, met his. "With respect, Your Honor, contempt of court has already been committed." "By you?" Gasps shivered through the gallery. The audacity of her words struck like a spark in dry tinder. Wallace's smirk returned, sharper this time, like a blade unsheathed. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" "Yes," Abigail replied. "The judge who should have recused himself the moment his own family became accuser. The judge who mocks instead of listens. The judge who forgot that justice belongs to the people, not to the Wallaces." For a heartbeat, Wallace faltered. Then he laughed, a harsh, cutting sound that drew others into nervous echo. Henderson chuckled too, seizing the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said smoothly, turning to the jury, "you see what desperation looks like: an untrained girl spouting fairy tales about gemstones, hoping to distract from cold, hard evidence." He gestured toward the necklace displayed under glass. "Here's the jewel. Here's where it was found. Open and shut." Abigail stepped closer, her voice calm. "Examine it. Not with your eyes, but with truth. If it were real, the flaw would sing. Instead, it is silent." Her words unsettled the jury. Several leaned forward, but Wallace struck again. "This is intolerable." He banged his gavel. "Miss Vance, you are not licensed to practice law. Your theatrics insult this court." He turned to Peterson, the weary public defender. "Control your volunteer." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. He had admired the girl's courage for a moment, but fear of Wallace outweighed admiration. "Abigail," he muttered, "maybe sit down. You'll only make it worse." The betrayal stung more than Wallace's words. Abigail's hands trembled, but she steadied them against the defense table. She whispered to her mother, "Trust me." Eleanor's tear-filled nod gave her strength. Wallace saw it and pounced. "This is precisely why servants remain servants," he sneered. "They mistake insolence for intelligence. You've embarrassed yourself and your mother." Laughter rippled again from the gallery. Mrs. Wallace smirked behind her pearls. Abigail's cheeks flushed, but not with shame, with anger. "Embarrassment," Abigail said clearly, "is parading a fake necklace in front of this court and calling it truth." The laughter faltered. Even Henderson's confident smile dimmed. He leaned toward Wallace, whispering something urgent. Wallace's eyes narrowed. He smelled danger now. He couldn't let this girl seize the stage. "Enough!" he thundered. "I will not allow a child to derail justice. Bailiff, remove her." Two officers stepped forward. Eleanor cried out, "Please, she's only trying to help." Abigail raised her chin. "If you silence me, you silence the truth, and everyone here will remember you chose fear over fact." Her words froze the jury. The bailiffs hesitated. Even they sensed the tide shifting. Wallace realized brute force alone might fracture his authority. He leaned back, voice dripping with condescension. "Very well, Miss Vance, 5 minutes. Present your theory, and when you fail, your mother's guilt will be sealed beyond doubt." The gallery murmured approval, a mix of amusement and curiosity. They wanted a spectacle. Wallace had given them one. Abigail opened her folder. Her fingers brushed over handwritten notes, appraisals copied from library books, diagrams of the necklace's flaw. She had prepared for this moment, though she never expected it to come so soon. She looked up at the jury. "Truth doesn't need a license," she said softly. "It just needs light." For the first time, the arrogance in Wallace's courtroom cracked. The girl he tried to humiliate had turned humiliation into fire. But behind his mask, Wallace was already plotting. He would not allow a maid's daughter to triumph, not in his courtroom, not against him. When the courtroom lights dimmed during recess, Abigail sat quietly, her folder clasped tight. But inside her mind, doors opened to memories that explained why she stood so unflinching before power. Years before this trial, the Vance apartment had been a single cramped room above a laundromat. The smell of starch and detergent clung to everything. Eleanor came home exhausted from 12-hour shifts at the Wallace estate, collapsing into a chair with aching feet. But Abigail didn't waste those nights. She climbed to the attic with a stack of borrowed library books, law primers, gemstone catalogs, biographies of great reformers. She read by the flicker of a desk lamp, tracing passages with her finger, whispering the words aloud until they stuck. To classmates, she was quiet, sometimes invisible. To teachers, she was diligent but ordinary. Only Eleanor knew the truth. Her daughter inhaled knowledge the way others inhaled air, and Abigail's curiosity had a compass. It always pointed toward fairness. When she read about miscarriages of justice, her fists clenched. When she found stories of whistleblowers or reformers, her eyes glowed. The attic became her courtroom in training, its rafters echoing with imagined arguments she practiced into the night. Her great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael O'Connell, was more than a name on a faded photograph. To Eleanor, he was the moral North Star. To Abigail, he became myth and mentor. During the war, O'Connell had served as a code breaker, his sharp eyes trained to spot patterns hidden in chaos. Afterward, he became a jeweler, channeling the same precision into gemstones. Every stone, he said, had a fingerprint imperfections that revealed its soul. Abigail never met him, but Eleanor carried his lessons like scripture. When Abigail was 10, Eleanor handed her O'Connell's old jeweler's loupe, the brass edges dented from years of use. "Your great-grandfather taught me to see beyond what shines," Eleanor whispered. "Now I'll teach you." On weekends, mother and daughter spread out trinkets from thrift shops, rhinestones, cubic zirconia, antique brooches. Abigail squinted through the loupe, learning to distinguish authenticity from imitation. Tiny fractures, cloudy inclusions, feathers and crystal signatures the eye could overlook, but the truth could not. To Abigail, it wasn't just gemology, it was justice. Lies looked perfect. Truth carried flaws. Abigail's obsession with justice sharpened when she was 13. She and Eleanor were at the Wallace mansion when she overheard Judge Wallace berating a delivery boy for scuffing his driveway with a bicycle tire. The boy's apology was dismissed. Wallace demanded compensation and threatened legal consequences. Abigail had stood frozen in the corridor, fury building. It wasn't the money, it was the joy Wallace seemed to take in wielding fear like a weapon. That night, she asked her mother, "Why does he get to treat people like that?" Eleanor had sighed. "Because people let him." Abigail whispered almost to herself, "I won't." From then on, she poured herself into studying not just gemstones, but the law. She discovered the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, cases of wrongful convictions overturned by dogged defense, the biographies of Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She copied quotes into a battered notebook, words she treated as incantations. Real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. There had been one more guide. Peterson, the public defender now too weary to fight, had once been different. Years ago, he'd visited Eleanor's church to give a talk on civil rights law. Abigail, barely 12, had sat in the front pew, eyes locked on every word. Afterward, she peppered him with questions until his throat went dry. He had laughed then, calling her the most relentless cross-examiner I've ever met. He'd even given her an old copy of Criminal Procedure, Cases and Comments, worn at the spine. "You won't understand it all yet," he told her, "but one day you will." Abigail did. She devoured it page by page, returning to passages again and again. When Peterson saw her years later in court, he hadn't recognized the fire he once sparked. His own flame had dimmed too much. But Abigail hadn't forgotten. 2 months before the trial, Eleanor had wept at the kitchen table, the accusation hanging over her like a storm. "I don't have the money for a lawyer," she whispered. "They'll bury me, Abby." Abigail had placed her hand on her mother's. "You won't be alone." Eleanor shook her head. "You're just a girl." "No," Abigail said softly. "I'm your daughter, and that means I'll fight." That night, Abigail returned to the attic. She spread out her notebooks, her loop, her books. She mapped the Wallace family's access to the necklace, noted every inconsistency in the report, and drafted questions she could one day ask in court. She rehearsed them aloud until her voice stopped trembling. By dawn, she had a plan not perfect, but sharp enough to pierce arrogance. The memory dissolved. The courtroom returned. Wallace glared down from his bench. Henderson shuffled his papers. The jury shifted uneasily. Abigail took a deep breath. She thought of O'Connell's loop in her pocket, of her mother's tears, of her attic rehearsals. She wasn't just Eleanor's daughter now. She was every page she'd ever read, every flaw she'd ever studied, every word she'd ever whispered into the attic air. Wallace believed her weapon was inexperience. He was wrong. Her weapon was preparation, and it was about to be unleashed. The courtroom resumed after recess, the air charged with unease. Judge Wallace struck his gavel with unnecessary force. "Miss Vance," he said, voice dripping disdain, "you have precisely 5 minutes. Use them, and when you fail, your mother's guilt will be sealed." The gallery leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. Henderson crossed his arms, confident she'd crumble. Even Peterson, her supposed ally, avoided her eyes. But Abigail stood taller than before. She carried not fear, but conviction. She pointed to the necklace under glass. "This is Exhibit A, the so-called Southern Star." Her words were calm, but each syllable carried weight. She gestured toward the jury. "You've all heard of its fame, not because it's flawless, but because it isn't. Every appraisal notes a feather-shaped inclusion near the clasp, like a faint white wing frozen in crystal." She lifted her chin. "But this piece?" She paused. "It has no feather. It is too perfect. And perfection in gemstones is the mark of forgery. The room shifted. Jurors exchanged glances. Henderson's smile faltered. Wallace scoffed loudly. Children and fairy tales? Do you expect this court to believe you oversworn officers? Abigail met his eyes. Yes, because I don't expect you to believe me. I expect you to believe the truth. From her folder, she pulled a handwritten appraisal. This is from Julian Reed, of Reed & Sons Jewelers. He swore under oath that 3 months ago, Mrs. Agatha Wallace commissioned a replica of the Southern Star, paid in cash, no record, but a jeweler remembers when a judge's wife visits. Gasps erupted. Mrs. Wallace's pearl-ringed hand trembled against her hat brim. Lies! Wallace thundered. His gavel pounded. This is contempt. Abigail's voice cut through. Contempt is presiding over your own family's case, Your Honor. Contempt is silencing defense. Contempt is framing a servant who had no keys to your safe. The gallery stilled. For the first time, fear not amusement flickered in their eyes. Red-faced, Wallace snarled, Enough! Bailiff, seize that document and arrest this girl for practicing law without a license. The officers hesitated. The jury froze. Even Henderson paled. Arresting her now would look like panic. Abigail placed the appraisal back into her folder. You can have me removed, Your Honor, but you cannot remove the truth. The people here have seen it. The jury has seen it. You can pound your gavel until it splinters, but facts don't break. The silence that followed was deafening. Wallace's authority, absolute for decades, had just cracked in front of everyone. Judge Wallace, cornered, tried to recover. This court will recess for 1 week to verify these outrageous claims, and to be clear, this girl will face contempt charges for her insolence. But the damage was done. His retreat signaled weakness. His threats sounded hollow. The jury now looked at Abigail not as a child, but as the only person speaking unvarnished truth. Abigail glanced at her mother, offering the smallest reassuring nod. Eleanor's shoulders shook with quiet sobs, not of despair this time, but of fragile hope. Abigail had broken the silence, and once broken, silence never returns whole. The courthouse was overflowing when Eleanor's case resumed a week later. Reporters swarmed the steps. Headlines screamed about the maid's daughter versus the judge. Wallace's allies whispered in tight knots, their confidence fraying. Inside, the air crackled with expectation. Judge Wallace had recused himself under pressure. In his place sat Judge Esposito, a stern but fair figure with no stake in the Wallace family's empire. Eleanor sat straighter at the defense table, but it was Abigail everyone watched. No longer dismissed as a reckless schoolgirl, she stood as the voice of truth. Henderson looked less certain now, his usual arrogance dulled. Judge Esposito opened, "This court has reviewed the extraordinary claims presented last week. Today, we will hear further testimony. Miss Abigail Vance, you may proceed." Abigail nodded. She carried not just her folder, but a new weapon, a small black memory card resting inside an evidence envelope. She began softly, almost conversational. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the question is simple. Who could have taken the Southern Star? Who had access to the locked case? Who had motive to sell it? And who had means to cover their tracks?" She gestured to her mother, not her. Eleanor Vance owned no key. She had no debts, no connections to fences or jewelers. Then Abigail turned, her gaze cutting through the gallery like a scalpel. "But Mrs. Agatha Wallace did." Gasps echoed. Mrs. Wallace stiffened, pearls rattling as she clenched her necklace. Your Honor, the defense calls Salvatore Genovese. An older man in a weathered suit shuffled forward. Owner of Salvatore's curios and fine gems, he looked reluctant but resolute. Judge Esposito swore him in. Mr. Genovese, Abigail asked, can you tell the court who visited your shop 3 months ago? Sal hesitated, then cleared his throat. Mrs. Agatha Wallace. She came with a necklace, the Southern Star. Gasps exploded. Abigail held up a flash drive. And you recorded the transaction, didn't you? Sal nodded. For my protection. I record everything valuable. Didn't think I'd need it, but I do now. Abigail passed the evidence to the bailiff. Moments later, the screen lit up with grainy footage. The courtroom leaned in. On screen, Agatha Wallace appeared, anxious and flustered. Her voice, though muffled, was clear enough. I need this sold. No questions asked. I'll take cash. My husband cannot know. Then Frankie, the fish Caruso, appeared beside her, an infamous Atlantic City figure. He held the necklace, examining it with a loupe. It's genuine, he said. I'll take it. Mrs. Wallace nodded, her hands trembling as she accepted a thick envelope of cash. The video ended. The courtroom erupted. Henderson scrambled to object, sweat beading his forehead. This could be doctored, fabricated. Abigail's reply was sharp. The defense also presents Mr. Genovese's ledger, handwritten, dated, and notarized by his accountant recording that exact transaction. She laid the ledger on the evidence table. Judge Esposito flipped through, eyes narrowing. Admissible. Henderson sank back, defeated. His once iron posture now sagged. Abigail stepped closer to the jury, her voice steady, strong. My mother was accused because she was powerless. She could not afford a real lawyer. She could not shout louder than a judge's gavel. So they made her the scapegoat. But the truth doesn't bow to power. It whispers in flaws, in ledgers, in hidden cameras. And if you're willing to listen, it tells the real story. She pointed toward Eleanor. A woman who served faithfully for 20 years was framed to cover debts and shame. And if a maid's daughter hadn't spoken, she would have been crushed beneath lies. She looked at the jury, each word deliberate. You do not need to trust me. Trust the stone's missing feather. Trust the jeweler's sworn testimony. Trust the video that speaks for itself. And above all, trust the truth you've seen with your own eyes. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent, but for the scratching of pens. Judge Esposito leaned forward. This court finds sufficient evidence to dismiss all charges against Eleanor Vance, with prejudice. Furthermore, the state will pursue criminal proceedings against Agatha Wallace for perjury, fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, not as Wallace's weapon, but as a true seal of justice. The fallout was swift. Reporters swarmed the Wallaces as officers escorted Agatha in handcuffs, her pearl necklace askew. Judge Wallace himself, though not yet charged, faced investigation for corruption and abuse of office. His empire of arrogance had collapsed in a single week. Abigail stood beside her mother, her hand squeezed tightly in Eleanor's. Cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer a shadow in the back of a classroom. She was the girl who had stared down a corrupt judge and lived to tell the truth. As they walked down the courthouse steps, the crowd erupted in cheers. Some chanted her name, Abigail! Abigail! For the first time, Eleanor lifted her chin with pride, not shame. The maid's daughter had revealed her true power, and the world had witnessed it. For years, Judge Wallace had commanded every courtroom he entered. His booming voice silenced objections. His gavel dictated reality. People bowed not out of respect, but fear. Now, as the bailiff escorted Agatha Wallace in handcuffs, all eyes shifted to him. The man who once towered over others sat hunched at the defense table, his once imperious face pale, his jaw tight with rage he could not express. The press had been merciless all week. Headlines screamed, "Judge's wife tied to mafia jewel sale. Wallace household under fire. Teen outsmarts the bench." Once, reporters courted his approval. Now, their cameras devoured his downfall. Judge Esposito, presiding from the bench, cleared his throat. "The record shall note that while this court does not pass criminal judgment today on Judge Wallace, sufficient evidence exists to warrant review by the state bar and a full federal inquiry." Gasps rippled. Wallace's hands trembled as he gripped the table. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. "Objection?" he croaked at last, voice cracking. This is a circus orchestrated by a child. You would take the word of a girl? Enough." Judge Esposito's gavel cracked like thunder. "Your protests do not erase evidence. You will have your chance in due process. For now, you will remain silent." Wallace froze, humiliated. For the first time in his career, he was not the voice of authority. He was the accused, a man stripped of robes, status, and control. The jury filed out, some glancing at him with open contempt. The gallery, once filled with his allies, now buzzed with whispered derision. Even Peterson, the weary public defender he had mocked, looked at Wallace with pity, not fear. When the bailiff approached, Wallace flinched. No cuffs yet, but the implication hung heavy. His hands twitched, searching for his gavel, his robe, something to anchor him. They weren't there. Only silence greeted him now. And then Abigail stood, not with gloating, not with venom. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You built your life on fear, sir, but fear collapses when truth walks in the door." Wallace's eyes flicked up, meeting hers. For the briefest second, he looked less like a tyrant and more like a broken man realizing his reign was over. The mighty judge had fallen not by sword or scandalous rumor alone, but by the quiet courage of a maid's daughter. The courthouse emptied into the golden glow of late afternoon. Cameras still flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Abigail guided her mother past them with quiet dignity. Eleanor's eyes brimmed with tears, not of fear this time, but of release. For the first time in years, she breathed freely. On the courthouse steps, the crowd erupted into applause. Some carried signs scrawled with words like "Justice and truth prevails." They weren't cheering for politicians or billionaires. They were cheering for a housekeeper and her daughter. Abigail paused at the top of the steps, looking back one last time. The courthouse loomed behind her, once a symbol of Wallace's dominance. Today, it stood as the place where a corrupt empire had cracked. Samuel Thorne approached, his hand extended. "You've got a sharp mind and a braver heart. When you're ready, the doors of my firm and every law school worth its salt will be open to you." Abigail shook his hand, steady and sure. She didn't smile, but her eyes carried quiet fire. Her mother whispered, voice breaking, "I thought I lost everything, Abby, but you reminded me we still had the truth, and that was enough." Abigail squeezed her mother's hand. The truth was always enough. They just needed someone willing to say it. They walked together through the crowd, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Reporters shouted for comment, cameras trailed them, but Abigail kept moving, her gaze fixed on the horizon. That night, back in their modest apartment, Eleanor cooked for the first time without the weight of dread pressing her shoulders. The kitchen smelled of garlic and rosemary, humble yet rich. Abigail sat at the table, flipping through one of her grandfather O'Connell's old books on gemstones, the same one that had sparked her defense. Eleanor placed a plate before her daughter, watching her with pride. "You're not just my Abigail anymore," she whispered. "You're someone the world will remember." Abigail looked up, smiling faintly. "I don't want them to remember me. I just want them to remember justice matters." Outside the window, the city hummed with life. Somewhere, Judge Wallace sat alone in silence, stripped of his throne. But here, in a small apartment lit by one lamp, something greater was born. The maid's daughter had stepped into her destiny not as a servant of wealth or fear, but as a servant of truth. And the world, bruised but listening, leaned closer.